This is a national emergency.
Detonator charged.
So in the career of every great film director comes a point where they get to make what I would call their career-defining film. A film that will forever be mentioned alongside their name, a film that will do well with audiences, win countless awards, and be forever a part of the discourse around the greatest films of all time. The career trajectories of film directors are very unpredictable. This is because there isn't really a set path that you can just follow and become successful. Some directors go to film school, some don't. Some start with commercials, some with TV, some with short films. Some start their careers off with a bang, and others have to wait decades until they get the recognition that they deserve. However, there are a few all-time great directors who share some similarities in their career arcs. Their careers were often full of iconic films that became part of pop culture, often pushing the boundaries of cinema technically or thematically or both. But it wasn't until a more serious kind of film that they got the awards and critical acclaim necessary to reach a higher level in the echelons of cinema history. These more serious films often represented a culmination in the director's technical skill and their unique vision, but adapted to a more grounded story. It was as if everything they learned on their previous films had honed their skills and given them the creative freedom necessary to tackle this more mature, ambitious film. It would be a film that would often differ from their previous work, either in genre, scope, or seriousness of its central theme. It would be a film they were sort of born to make, either because of their unique lived experiences, their unique skills as filmmakers, or in most cases both. All of these films share some common threads. They are usually telling a story that connects with audiences on a very fundamental human level. This is because it's usually based on real events, or at least loosely rooted in some historical fact. Next, the film is often centered and carried by an incredible performance at the center of it. A performance that will be often just as iconic as the film itself. And finally, they usually have an elite filmmaking crew that is at their absolute A-game, while being curated by a director at the peak of their filmmaking prowess and their command of film language. And yes, I'm saying Oppenheimer is this mature, ambitious, career-defining film, and Christopher Nolan is the director who was born to make it. Pre-Schindler's List, I think you can argue that Spielberg's directing portfolio was in fact very similar to Nolan's, and so I often compare Nolan's career path to Spielberg's. They both had their summer blockbuster hits, they both made beloved sci-fi films, and both made entertaining films featuring characters that would become a part of pop culture. Spielberg's films were hailed for their innovative world building, their sense of adventure and wonder, and of course their iconic John Williams soundtrack. However, it wasn't until Schindler's List that Spielberg truly became cemented as this all-time great director. The film marked a turning point in his career and showcased his versatility and maturity as a filmmaker, as it demonstrated his ability to tackle a more poignant and socially significant story. In Nolan's case, I think what sets him apart is his ability to push the boundaries of genre, his use of unorthodox narrative structures, and his use of time as this unique storytelling tool to create mind-bending and often intellectually challenging blockbusters. Unlike Spielberg, Nolan writes his own films, so they often stand out of the field with their original vision. This can often be a blessing, creating incredibly immersive and thought-provoking cinematic experiences that are beloved by audiences, but it can also be a curse. Sometimes Nolan can get overconsumed with his ideas and forget about things that truly matter, like character depth or comprehensible sound mix. Nolan has yet to embark on a project that delves into the same level of emotional depth and historical significance as Schindler's List. He sort of had an opportunity with Dunkirk, but instead of making a classical war movie, Nolan decided to make an experimental film. Although Dunkirk was a great technical achievement and demonstrated Nolan's exceptional skill as a director, it didn't really have the wider appeal, the dramatic depth, or the sense of scale. But mainly, it didn't have the ambition to be that career-defining film for Nolan. And I think Oppenheimer does. I truly believe that the story of Oppenheimer complements Nolan's strengths as a filmmaker unlike any other film he's made so far. It is also just an incredibly dense story with a lot of depth and interesting characters that I think will surprise audiences with just how culturally relevant they are. So first off, you have the central idea. At the center of the story is the struggle of man against his creation, a timeless story and something we've seen many times in cinema and literature. Frankenstein obviously comes to mind, so do other films though, like 2001, The Terminator, and so on. The thing that separates Oppenheimer from this group, however, is the fact that this isn't some sci-fi story. This is a story of a real man set against the backdrop of real events that forever altered the course of history and whose lingering impact is still very real and relevant today. Then we have the story. Oppenheimer is directly based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book American Prometheus: The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. In the past, Nolan has dabbled with adaptation on numerous projects, and each time it's safe to say he's done a stellar job. From what I know, the story of Oppenheimer has an incredibly wide array of topics and ideas that I think will resonate with modern audiences. The most obvious one is the threat of nuclear war, where after decades, nuclear war has once again entered the general discourse in Western society. Then we have the central idea itself, this idea of a man and his creation, and all the parallels between the development of nuclear technology and the development of artificial intelligence today. Also, when you look at the historical context, the invention of the nuclear bomb marked a very specific breaking point in the history of human civilization. There's a clear before and after. The world was never the same after the Trinity test. I'm convinced that this will be one of the key messages of the film, just how big of an impact the Manhattan Project had on the world. The bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered a change in socio-political thinking. People became enamored with the destructive potential of atomic power, but also how it could be used to positively impact the future of mankind, while its opponents were quickly dispatched by ruining their reputations and scientific credibility. Which leads me to my next few points that I believe this film will cover. First, the complicated relationship between science and politics, and how big of a burden the bureaucracy of scientific institutions can be on one man and his ideas. The film's timeline will overlap with the era of McCarthyism, which I believe can once again serve as a parallel to our world, whether it's the concept of cancel culture or the idea of science being corrupted by various ideologies and higher interests. I believe Oppenheimer will touch all of these topics and even more. The entire operation at Los Alamos served as the foundation for what is known as the military-industrial complex. The Manhattan Project was one of the largest government-funded research and manufacturing projects in history, and it became a building block of arms establishment that would gain tremendous influence over the coming years and remains one of the biggest, if not the biggest, lobbying power in Washington, D.C. to this day. As I mentioned earlier, most career-defining films have an iconic performance at the center of them. I don't think I need to spend too much time explaining why Cillian Murphy and his portrayal of Oppenheimer checks all the boxes for such a performance. Look, he's just overdue for a role like this, and I believe he'll absolutely crush it. The performance that isn't getting as much hype though is Robert Downey Jr. and his portrayal of Louis Strauss. I think people might have forgotten just how incredibly talented actor Robert Downey Jr. is. And then there's the rest of this incredibly stacked cast, of course, which I'm not going to go over, but you know, the film is just packed with talent in front of the camera and behind the camera. Which brings me to the crew. Nolan pretty much works with the same team on every project. Oppenheimer is no different. And it's not just the big names like Hoyte van Hoytema doing the cinematography. Nolan is really working with the best in the business. His sound team pretty much sweeps all awards every time they make a film. I think they got like 4 or 5 Oscars by now. And his visual effects team, well, just think about this. According to Nolan, Oppenheimer has no CGI shots whatsoever. Everything was done practically in camera. How next level do you have to be to recreate not only a nuclear explosion practically, but all the visuals in the quantum realm, all the small atomic reactions? It is just mind-boggling. And speaking of quantum realm, This brings me to my next point, which is the science of this film. With films like Interstellar and Tenet, Nolan has demonstrated his ability to communicate complex scientific theories and ideas in a way that make them accessible for a mainstream audience. The films were complex, sure, but especially in Interstellar's case, Nolan centered the film around concepts from theory of relativity and managed to not lose his audience in the process. This time, he'll have to do the same with quantum physics, and I believe he'll do an even better job. Speaking of science, there's also the matter of depicting genius. I believe this is a new challenge for Nolan. How do you depict genius in a way that feels fresh and exciting for the audience? Now, I haven't seen the film or heard Nolan directly talk about this, but knowing him, I believe he's aware of how physicists and geniuses have been historically depicted in movies, and I think he'll do a different take on it. When I was reading Richard Feynman's biography, what really grabbed my attention was how starstruck he was as a young prodigy working at Los Alamos, and meeting and working with all these renowned scientists like Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, Ernest Lawrence, Hans Bethe, Enrico Fermi, and others. The way Feynman described them, he viewed them as rock stars. I think if Nolan can somehow manage to get that same excitement about these legends and the cutting-edge science they were doing across to the audience, it will not only elevate the overall story, but also be historically accurate. The period during which the film takes place is often considered the golden age of physics, and I'm sure Nolan is aware of this. After all, one thing you can never deny Nolan is the amount of meticulous research he does for all of his films. Ultimately, I think the success of Oppenheimer will depend on Nolan's ability to juggle the very big and the very small. From the smallest of reactions on the atomic scale to the biggest nuclear explosions on the grandest scale. I think the great challenge will be just how well Nolan will manage to do the same on the emotional level though. He'll have to take the audience on a journey and express how the very small, intimate decisions and conflicts of one man will have the largest of ramifications for humanity as a whole. Is Nolan up to the task? I believe he is. And so, just some final words. I really hope that people will go see this film in the cinema on the largest screen possible, because it is the way it was meant to be seen. And you might wonder, why do I care so much? Well, because the future of film kind of hinges on the success or failure of Oppenheimer. Films like this don't get made anymore. The middle-of-the-road, standalone films are a dying breed in Hollywood these days. You're either doing a tentpole blockbuster or you're doing an independent film. If films like Oppenheimer can overperform at the box office, it will signal that there is still a demand to see real films in the cinema. What has happened over the past few years is that corporate products have been slowly but surely killing the theatrical release of real films, as their theatrical windows have been getting shorter and shorter. And so, if I can just convince one of you to go see this in the cinema, then this video has really served its purpose. And that's pretty much it from me. Now, go and buy your IMAX tickets. I'll see you on the other side.